I want to start with an entry in the logbook for Nunnington School in the North Riding of Yorkshire, dated the 26th of April. Admitted 2 boys from Muscoats. These boys, H. Reed and W. Reed, have never been to school before and just know their letters. I'm becoming quite disheartened with the work, such a standard I never had in my life. So that's Herbert Reed at the age of about 8. He's the central figure, seated on the harrow. I should have a picture of, that's Muscoats, the farm in North Yorkshire, just north of Nunnington, between Nunnington and Kirby Moorside, where he was born and grew up. This is an informal photograph of the boys. My father on the left, his brother William on the right, and the third brother Charles in the middle. There is a family legend of an incident with his older cousin, much older cousin Sissy, who was the doyenne of Howkeld Mill near Kirby Moorside, trying to get Herbert to talk posh. You must say yes, Bertie. Now say yes. Aye. And this carried on. This may be simply early stubbornness, or I like to think an early instance of what my father later wrote about the egotistical sublime, which is, you know you're always right. He wasn't going to take sort of telling off by his cousin. So maybe we have a bit of a conundrum, to use a long word. Last time I used a long word this evening. How did an educationally backward farmer's son develop into, first of all, a major war poet of the First World War, let alone a major writer on art, politics, psychoanalysis, literature, during the first half of the 20th century? A bit of family background. His father died in his 10th year. He was a tenant farmer on the Feversham estates, and so the family were evicted from the farm immediately. After a while, the 3 boys were sent to Crossley and Porter's orphanage in Halifax, which catered not just for orphans, but for one-parent families, as the Reeds by then were. His mother eventually moved to Leeds, where she got work. Herbert Reed's account of the school, the orphanage, is fairly bleak, but he did admit the inspiration of the headmaster, who spotted Reed's total absorption in reading and encouraged him. Herbert Reed edited a school magazine to which he contributed. So already as a schoolboy he was reading and writing. He left school at age 16, sufficiently qualified to be a bank clerk for the Leeds, Skyrack and Morley Bank in Leeds. But he was determined to better himself. His mother and other relatives wanted him to stick to a nice, safe job, but he wanted to go to university. He was very lucky that he fell in with the encouragement of a Leeds tailor called William Pryor Reed, who was absolutely no relation. The story is that his mother went with his younger brother William to buy herself a coat or something. The shop was in Briggate, Lower Briggate, and the tailor said to the young lad, "What's your name, young man?" He said, "William Reed." And he said, "Oh, that's my name as well." And he more or less adopted the 3 boys, became their father figure. He was a Quaker pacifist, obviously caused problems with the war, but he was a voracious reader and encouraged Herbert Reed to in his reading and eventually in his writing. Herbert Reed studied at local libraries, evening classes and so on, and in 1912 was admitted to the University of Leeds. He raised funding for this by going to another miller uncle who ran the mill called Hold Cauldron, just above Kirkdale, near Kirby Moorside. the dramatic setting of which, still there, later featured in Reed's novel The Green Child. The Green Child, the scenes at the mill are set at Old Cauldron. He was inspired by being a student. Here is Ginner's drawing of Leeds University, sitting in the library, obviously doing his coursework, but he sort of started looking at the shelves surrounding him, and there, above all, he discovered the works of Nietzsche. He had a mental brainstorm, and his life was never the same since. He joined the Leeds Arts Club, he met Jacob Kramer, and all the impact and influence of the revolutionary ideas. And I can only recommend to you Tom Steele's book, not just because Tom's here, but because it's a very good book and tells you the full story. He saw Michael Sadler's amazing collection, not through Sadler, but through the back door, because his mother was a friend of Sadler's housekeeper, and so he got in that way. He wasn't very sociable with his family. My Uncle Billy used to tell me that he would come back from university, slam the door and just go up to his attic room to read books, and he didn't sort of talk to the rest of them. What he did was for social reasons, he joined the officers' training corps at the university. He claimed for social reasons. So he was obviously subject to call-up once the war broke out. And then there followed the war writings. Now there are, first of all, the so-called war diaries, which were first published in 1963. They're not diaries at all. These were letters he wrote back from his military times to Evelyn Roth, another Leeds student, a particular friend whom he was to marry after the First World War. These letters contained a lot about what he was reading in the barracks and the trenches. These aren't in the war book, but there is quite a lot of anecdotal narrative about the war, where he was going, what was happening, and so on, and those we did include in the book. Rest Camp Boyel, 1917. These are drawings, there are a number of them I'll be showing you. These are drawings by Herbert Reed. They've never been published. They come from a sketchbook dated 1917, and they are a very strange and interesting mixture. Bill Towers was, I think, is mentioned in the book. He was, I think, his sort of servant backman, because he was an officer, having been in the officers' training corps. He started off as second lieutenant, then became first lieutenant, and ultimately captain. We don't know who Archie was, but you will see the style is a little different. This is an old soldier. Intriguing because they vary between the sort of naturalistic, representational, and a sort of semi-vorticist style. And here one must remember, I think, the two exhibitions which Tom talks about, held in Leeds. There was the Post-Impressionist exhibition, but also the Vorticist exhibition. My suspicion is that they're not necessarily modelled on Lewis. My suspicion is that there is an early connection with Wadsworth, because the first work of art my father bought was a print by Wadsworth from Frank Rutter's gallery in 1919. And there were two Yorkshiremen. I don't know, I've never managed to sort of find the time to follow this up. Other drawings relate directly to poetry written on the spot. This is an aeroplane landing, and in the book there is the poem Aeroplanes. I will read to you. A dragonfly in the flecked grey sky. Its silvered planes break the wide and still harmony of space. Around its shells flash their fumes, burgeoning to blooms, smoke lilies that float along the sky, among them darts a dragonfly. Herbert Reed's drawing of the road to Polygonveld, and there is a passage in a long poem called Nishaw Goes to War. There are a few left who will find it hard to forget Polygonveld. The earth was scarred and broken by torrents of plunging shells, then washed and sodden with autumnal rains, and Polygon Becker, perhaps a rippling stream in the days of Nishaw's gloom, spread itself like a fatal quicksand, a sucking, clutching death. They had to be across the Becker and in their line before dawn. A man who was marching by Nishaw's side hesitated in the middle of the mud and slowly sank, weighted down by equipment and arms. He cried for help. Rifles were stretched to him. He clutched and they tugged, but slowly he sank. His terror grew visibly when the viscous ooze reached his neck, and there he seemed to stick, sinking no more. They could not dig him out. The oozing mud would flow back again. The dawn was very near. An officer shot him through the head. Impression de Croisille, which I will read you a poem called Village Démoli. The villages are strewn in red and yellow heaps of rubble. Here and there, interior walls lie upturned and interrogate the skies amazedly. Walls that once held within their cubic confines a soul that now lies strewn in red and yellow heaps of rubble. The poems as published are undoubtedly Imagist in style. Reed had already been reading and then meeting members of the Imagist movement. He was for a time a close friend of F.S. Flint, a lesser known but very sharp Imagist poet. The style of the drawings, as I've said, too, verges on vorticism, and I mentioned he became a very close friend of Frank Rutter, and they met up during the war and after the war. And I think this was a close connection. I think they drifted apart later. Some of the poems are quite savage. One called The Crucifix. His body is smashed through the belly and chest. The head hangs lopsided from one nailed hand. Emblem of agony, we have smashed you. And then, perhaps the best known of these war poems, The Happy Warrior. His wild heart beats with painful sobs. His strained hands clench an ice-cold rifle. His aching jaws grip a hot, parched tongue. His wide eyes search unconsciously. He cannot shriek. Bloody saliva dribbles down his shapeless jacket. I saw him stab and stab again a well-killed Boche. This is the happy warrior. This is he. No punches pulled. Others we know are based on real events. There's a poem called Leedholtz. When I captured Leedholtz, I had a blackened face. Here you must excuse the original language. I had a blackened face like a nigger's, and my teeth like white mosaic shone. We met in the night at 1:30, between the lines. Leedholtz shot at me, and I at him. In the ensuing tumult, he surrendered to me. Before we reached our wire, he told me he had a wife and 3 children. In the dugout, we gave him a whiskey. Going to the brigade with my prisoner at dawn, the early sun made the land delightful, and larks rose singing from the plain. In broken French, we discussed Beethoven, Nietzsche, and the International. He was a professor living at Spandau and not too intelligible, but my black face and nigger's teeth amused him. It's a rather intriguing incident because there are actually 3 accounts of this that Reed wrote. One is the poem, the other is the narrative description in the diaries, and then he wrote it up as a separate, as an essay which was published by Eliot in the Criterion pamphlets and appeared in 1930. For this event, Reed was awarded the Military Cross. This is a war landscape by Reed, 1917, and if you look at the sort of couple of wizened trees, this is Paul Nash, Hill 60, and as Reed wrote much later about Paul Nash, it was in 1918, straight back from the front, that I first saw a collection of Nash's drawings made as an official artist in France. I was immediately convinced, because here was someone who could convey, as no other artist, the phantasmagoric atmosphere of no man's land. And this particular print was personally given to Reed by Paul Nash. I think this shared experience of those who had fought in the war, my father wrote briefly about it, with Nash, with Moore, with the novelist Richard Aldington, now I think largely forgotten. They all shared this background. I remember my father writing once that he always felt that there was, with Eliot, who became a close personal friend, there was this sort of divide, because Eliot hadn't fought in the war. And those who hadn't fought were very conscious of the camaraderie of those who had been through this terrible experience. Many of the poems, the war poems, were first published in Naked Warriors. You see the cover here, published by Art and Letters, the journal founded by Frank Rutter in London in 1917, and initially co-edited with Reed. It has on the cover a device by Wyndham Lewis, which was first used in the magazine, which was slightly ironic, as we shall see in a moment. On the 21st of March 1918, the German army launched a last campaign to try and defeat the Allies. Herbert Reed was caught up in this, based near the French town of Saint-Quentin. Like much of the British army, he was forced to retreat. His commanding colonel was wounded and removed, and Reed became the commander for his particular battalion. He was to publish a prose account of this in 1925, called In Retreat, published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf at the Hogarth Press. It is an amazing account. It is in a way dispassionate, but does not spare a single gory detail. It is republished in its entirety in the War Book. It relates, for instance, how the group retired to some trenches that were marked on the maps they had to take cover, only to find that only the top marking sods of the trenches had been removed and there were no trenches there. And all the time they were under continuous machine gun fire and shelling. But that wasn't all they had to put up with. They were as battered by their own artillery, getting the wrong distance, what is now insultingly called friendly fire. This is the irony of the Wyndham Lewis device. In the 1950s, Lewis was to attack Reed in his book, The Demon of Progress in the Arts. In answering this attack, Reed said he wasn't at all surprised, because Lewis had served in the artillery during World War I, and he'd been through it all before. Few survived this retreat. Among the officers, only the group in the slide, inscribed on the back in Reed's hand, all that was left of them. As if to compound the trauma, a few months later, a month before the armistice, Reed's youngest brother Charles, by all accounts the most popular of the three brothers, was killed in action. I went with my cousin, my uncle Billy's son. We actually found the grave and visited it this summer, and this is the record of it. My father was by then stationed in Middlesbrough. he had to retire to a park there, where he composed a long poem of commemoration called Auguries of Life and Death. Later he felt the poem was too raw, too immediate, and for a time he excluded it from the various collected poems he brought out throughout the rest of his life. So I'll only read you a part. The autumn leaves were an augury and seemed to intend, as they yellowly drooped in the languid air, that life was a fragile mood and death a tremendous despair. The yellow leaves fell like slow tears of gold on the face of the day. They fell to the earth with a faint sad sigh. They sighed as the feet of the passers-by crushed them into the moist black soil. They sighed when the gentle wind lifted them along the way. In the park old men swept the dead things in a heap to burn. Their last fragrance floated about the naked trees. I thought as the women walked in the moist, still day, wearing yellow chrysanthemums in their coats. A chrysanthemum was a pale, dishevelled emblem of death. The sun was a silver pervasion across the sky. From the sky the dead leaves fell. Some well-meaning fool called him an unconscious Sydney, proudly dying in the surge of battle. Many said he paid the supreme sacrifice. Let us be frank for once. Such foisted platitudes cannot console sick hearts. Rather, this alone is clear. He was a delightful youth, irradiating joy, peculiarly loved by hundreds of his fellows. The impulse of his living left a wake of laughter and happiness in the hearts of sad men. All the world is wet with tears and droops its languid life in sympathy. But death is beautiful with pride. The trees are golden lances whose brave array assails the sadness of the day. They do not meet fate with an angry tumult. Serene they stay, austerely dying day by day. Their golden lances imperceptibly fade into the sleep of winter, their victory made in the hearts of men. We can perhaps only guess the full impact of all the horrors Herbert Reed experienced during his war service: the slaughter, the bodies, the mud. My nephew James, in his excellent introduction to the book, reveals that my father twice was sent to hospital back in England. Shell shock, it was called. Post-traumatic disorder now. In other words, some form of nervous breakdown. Interestingly to me, at any rate, James also looks at my father's accounts and analyses of cowardice and courage, usually referring to somebody else, but there is a case that sometimes this incorporated some form of self-analysis. In any case, I think there can be no doubt that Herbert Reed suffered immensely from his war experiences, and as we shall see, he was to go back to them directly or indirectly for the rest of his life. This was unlike his younger brother, William, whom those of you of a very senior status may remember as a stalwart of the Leeds textile community. The building by the bus station, now inscribed Monroe House, with cafes and art galleries, when I was a boy, was proudly inscribed William Reed. It was my Uncle Billy's warehouse and factory. Uncle Billy had been invalided out of the war in 1917, having suffered a severe injury. According to his son, my cousin Charles, he never once referred to his war experiences, except for the one occasion when his mind had already begun to go. The news was on television and was featuring, dare I say it, a relatively minimal death toll in the Iraq War. My uncle suddenly spoke out. You wouldn't make a fuss like that if you had lost 600 of your men in one morning. So he had experienced the full horrors of the war as well. As I've said, the majority of my father's various war writings in poetry and prose began to appear from 1919 onwards. A new format for these appeared in the 1920s, in reviews he wrote and published of other war books. These varied in their coverage and where they appeared. One selection from an unidentified source, preserved in the Reed Archive at the university here, includes some German war books he reviewed, plus some other English ones. One is of several books. One of them is a book called Field Guns in France. It's made up of letters written by an artillery officer in France between November 1915 and August 1918. Colonel Fraser Tytler, the author, took the business of killing seriously and does not hesitate to say so. He carried to war all the callous efficiency which a sportsman of his type usually devotes to the shooting of game. Indeed, he has the effrontery to print as an appendix and to call it such, a game book of German casualties from personal observations, totaling 412 Huns. But reprehensible as this attitude of mind is, it is almost noble compared with the disgusting levity of War Bugs, another book, described by the publishers as the American version. To treat the war as a tragedy is perhaps tiresome. To treat it as a necessary business is perhaps unintelligent. But to treat it as a good joke is merely obscene. Others were much more serious. This is a portrait by William Rothenstein of General Herbert de la Poer-Goff of 1932. And Herbert Reed wrote a review of there were a series of volumes of the official history of World War I, and he wrote a review of the volume dealing with March 1918, that is the month of the retreat. Goff, whom you see here, I'll read the extracts from the review in a moment, was a much more interesting character than one might suppose. He came from an Anglo-Irish military family. He was a senior officer at the Curragh Barracks in Ireland in 1916, from where he led a deputation to London to insist that the Anglo-Irish officers in Ireland, while they would keep the peace, would not enforce Irish Home Rule on Ulster. There were all sorts of kerfuffles in London. Ministerial and civil service opinions kept changing, which sounds only too familiar. And finally Goff's point of view was taken. But he was a marked man. As General Officer commanding in France in 1918, in March 1918, when the Germans launched their attack, he had to carry the can. As General Haig, who was a friend of his, was alleged to have remarked, either he takes the blame or I do, and with all due modesty said, Haig, I'm much more important to the cause than he is. Apparently he was eventually given his due, but not till 1935. But Goff had been a popular commander. He was a get-up-and-go general, always wanting to lead from the front and not from a desk. And this appears in Leeds' review of the March 1918 volume of the official history. So far as my own experience of the events goes, the history is very accurate, and most of the comments made are just. The decisive part played by the fog, particularly on the first day of the attack, is rightly emphasised, but the complete breakdown of artillery cooperation is perhaps not stressed sufficiently. The fog partly accounted for this, but the air observation of the Royal Flying Corps was both inadequate and inaccurate. My own battalion was twice shelled out of its position by our own artillery. It is bad enough to be shelled from the front, but at the same time to be shelled from the back produces a terribly demoralising effect. In commenting on the first day's fighting, General Edmonds, the author, is perhaps a little hard on the men on the spot. There is one point made by General Edmonds in his preface that calls for the greatest publicity. It is related to the commander of the Fifth Army. The army, in particular his own army, felt and still feel that as regards events in 1918 he was unfairly treated. This statement is only made only after discussion with hundreds of officers, amongst whom there was no dissentient. An inquiry was refused to General Gough, and he is still in the public mind under a cloud. The truth is his reputation was sacrificed to shield the real culprits, the British General Headquarters, who did not take his warning seriously enough, and the French, particularly General Pétain, who completely misjudged the whole situation. And this is now Reed writing, surely it is not too late to honour the general of an army which, against overwhelming odds, fought and won the decisive battle of the Great War. That was the March attack. This is a portrait of Erich Maria Remarque and his wife Paulette Goddard, taken in 1958. I'll explain the photo in a moment. Remarque's book, All Quiet on the Western Front, Herbert Reed reviewed at least twice. One of them goes, in Germany this book sold 200,000 copies in the first 3 weeks after publication. By now, not 3 months after publication, the number of copies sold approaches 500,000. And yet it is a severe masculine book, even a brutal book. It is devoid of romanticism. Indeed, it is the negation of romanticism. It cannot be read for pleasure. It is terrible, almost unendurable in its realism and pathos. But it has swept like a gospel over Germany and must sweep over the whole world, because it is the first completely satisfying expression in literature of the greatest event of our time. I have already in another periodical committed myself to the statement that this is the greatest of all war books. I have now read it 6 or 7 times. I have discussed it with men of all degrees, especially with those whose experience of the war was as complete as that of the author. I have tested it faithfully against my own memories, and always my conviction remains firm. This book is the Bible of the common soldier, the Tommy in the front line who month after month endured the mess and stink of death and all the loud riot of killing, the testament of the only man who is competent and worthy to speak of the war. When this kind of experience is presented in anger and without art, it only arouses resentment and pity. But this book wins our sympathy by its detachment and by its aesthetic merits. It is a superb piece of construction. It consists of a number of separate scenes and events, varying in tone from the farcical to the tragic, which piece together into a mosaic which has a unity of its own. Each scene is representative of a phase of war experience. At the end of the book, it is difficult to think of any significant experience of a man at the front which is not represented. Everything is there: horror, coarseness, lewdness, humour, pathos, comradeship, even the unexpected beauty of nature. Gradually, death takes toll of it all. No idealism is left in this generation. We cannot believe in democracy or socialism or the League of Nations. To be told at the front that we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy was to be driven to the dumb verge of insanity. On a mutual respect for each other's sufferings, we built up that sense of comradeship which was the war's only good gift. But death destroyed even this, and we were left with only the bare desire to live, although life itself was past our comprehension. As I say, I do apologise for this much later photograph of Remarque and his wife, the film star Paulette Goddard. This is an unqualified piece of self-boasting promotion, and it was about this time that I met them. We were in Ascona in Switzerland, and aged 13, I had one of my diabetic funny turns. My father was on his way to visit the Remarques, and to this day I recall being more or less dandled on Paulette Goddard's knee as she fed me a sticky sugar biscuit, which was exactly what I needed to restore my blood sugar levels. But it's not something one might forget in a hurry. go back to the series. Even in the 1930s, there were poetry throwbacks to World War I. Most important of these was The End of a War, published in 1933. This is a long poem dealing with an incident that occurred in November 1918, involving a murdered French girl in a village, a wounded German officer, and a British officer who came across the incident. It is a tripartite poem involving three voices, a bit like the much later poem Moon's Farm, which my father wrote about returning to Yorkshire, and like that concerned with reflection and philosophizing. A shorter poem of 1935 is Logos. Suddenly he began to torture the flowers, began to twist red winter tulips, faced by the behemothine jaws for which there is no inevitable in and out, the carnage at the Menin Gate, the startled blackcock's raucous cry, the Morse code of a boot and crutch filled the space between river and sky. But stay, the light is cancelled there, the dark eyes cease to stare at suns, and light breaks in behind the brain. Another is War and Peace. Again, it's 20 years or so after the war. The kind of war is changed. The crusade heart outshattered, flesh a stain on broken earth, and death an unresisted rain. The horror loosed, all honour is lost. Peace is pride and passion, but no evil to equal the indignity of war, whose ringing anvil wins only anguish. The weighted hammer breaks the stretched tendons at the wrist, and leaves the soul a twisted nail, tearing the flesh that still would live, and give to words the brutal end of truth. And then, of course, there came the Spanish Civil War. All intellectuals took side in this, mainly in defence of the Republic. Reed, though, was by then a declared anarchist, so caught between the two main opposing forces, whose only common policy was the extermination of the anarchists. Picasso, Dream and Lie of Franco. He wrote passionately in anarchist publications, but also deeply felt poetry. This is Bombing Casualties in Spain. Dolls' faces are rosier, but these were children, their eyes not glass but gleaming gristle, dark lenses in whose quick silvery glances the sunlight quivered. These blenched lips were warm once and bright with blood, but blood held in a moist bleb of flesh, not spilt and spattered in tousled hair. In these shadowy tresses, red petals did not always thus clot and blacken to a scar. These are dead faces. Wasps' nests are not so wanly waxen, wood embers not so greyly ashen. They are laid out in ranks like paper lanterns that have fallen after a night of riot, extinct in the dry morning air. The poem was inspired by a newspaper photograph of children who'd been killed. Another was The Heart Conscripted. The shock of silver tassels, the sledded breath, I who have fought my battles keep these in a sheath. The ulcer of exact remorse from which the lake poet perished, the owl's indifferent hood, these have vanished. I hear only the sobbing fall of various water clocks and the swift, inveterate wail of the destructive axe. Lorca was killed singing, and Fox, who was my friend. The rhythm returns, the song which has no end. Note, I who have fought my battles, the song which has no end. The continued memory of war. He wrote a powerful defence of Guernica, comparing it to Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece, and this brought him into conflict with the then young Marxist critic Anthony Blunt. who denounced Guernica for not being socialist realist, and they had a right royal ding-dong in the press. After which, it appears, they would meet in the Reform Club for lunch, both saying, "I say, old chap, I didn't really mean to go quite so far." Blunt later recanted his view of the painting, saying Herbert was quite right, including once in my presence as he gave a farewell talk at the Courtauld. In 1938, with war possibly looming, Reed was able to resume living in the house he had built in Buckinghamshire in 1926 as his boom house. Dates for its constructions do vary, but he once told me quite explicitly it was under construction during the general strike, which was in 1926. It is an intriguing house, or was, I think it's been altered. He designed it in part himself, with assistance allegedly from one of the Mutesius family. I recently asked my good friend Stephen Mutesius at East Anglia if he knew anything about this, and he said he had checked the family archives. The coming of the war certainly affected Reed in various ways. T.S. Eliot asked him to take charge of a suitcase of spare clothing in case Eliot's own flat in London was bombed. George Orwell asked Reed if he would take in a spare printing press in face of what would obviously be government clamping down on the freedom of the press, a just foreboding granting what I will refer to briefly in the post-war period. Reed also served as an air raid warden. He wrote to his friend Henry Miller, "I took an oath at the end of the last war that I would never fight again. My hatred of war has kept me out of this one." But he did admit to walking the Buckinghamshire lanes under the stars to watch for a falling bomb which never fell. Inevitably, another war brought recollections of the earlier one. One of his best-known war poems is the one called To a Conscript of 1940. A soldier passed me in the freshly fallen snow, his footsteps muffled, his face unearthly grey, and my heart gave a sudden leap as I gazed on a ghost of 25 years ago. I shouted, "Halt!" and my voice had the old accustomed ring, and he obeyed it as it was obeyed in the shrouded days when I too was one of an army of young men marching into the unknown. He turned towards me and I said, "I am one of those who went before you 25 years ago, one of the many who never returned, of the many who returned and yet were dead. We went where you are going, into the rain and the mud. We fought as you will fight, with death and darkness and despair. We gave what you will give, our brains and our blood. We think we gave in vain. The world was not renewed. There was hope in the homestead and anger in the streets, but the old world was restored, and we returned to the dreary field and workshop and the immemorial feud of rich and poor. Our victory was our defeat. Power was retained where power had been misused, and youth was left to sweep away the ashes that the fires had strewn beneath our feet. But one thing we learned, there is no glory in the deed until the soldier wears a badge of tarnished grade. There are heroes who have heard the rally and have seen the glitter of a garland round their head. Theirs is the hollow victory. They are deceived. But you, my brother and my ghost, if you can go, knowing that there is no reward, no certain use in all your sacrifice, then honour is reprieved. To fight without hope is to fight with grace, the self reconstructed, the false heart repaired. Then I turned with a smile, and he answered my salute as he stood against the fretted hedge, which was like white lace. It also brought one of my personal favourites, centred on Broom House and its surroundings, but with hints of threat. I'll read only very brief extracts. Starts the poem, A World Within a War. 16 years ago I built this house by an oak tree on an acre of wild land. its walls white against the beechwood, its roof of Norfolk reed and sedge. The mossy turf I levelled for a lawn, but for the most part left the acre wild, knowing I could never live from its stony soil. My work is within, between 3 stacks of books. My window looks out on a long line of elms. Then he gets quite sort of playful. And I will sedate within this palisade, which unforethinking I have made, of brittle leaves and velvet flowers, I re-indite a book of hours. Would emulate the Lombard school, Christmas medals, bright but cool. Talk mainly of the human passion. It made us in a conscious fashion. Strive to control our human fate, but in the margins interpolate apes and angels playing tunes on harpsichords or saxophones. Throughout the story thus maintain under a sacred melody the base profane. My saints were often silly men, fond of wine and loose with women. When they rose to holy stature, they kept the whims of human nature, were mystics in their London gardens, or wore instead of hair shirts burdens of a mild domestic source. But so devout that suddenly they would go out and die for freedom in the street, or fall like partridges before a butt of ambushed tyranny and hate. Modernists are perhaps unaware that before his involvement with 20th century art, Herbert worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where he wrote a massive book on English medieval stained glass, published in 1926. This is St. William's window at York Minster. There exists a sketchbook containing his study drawings for this book, including an angel from a Fairford window. This is one of the windows at Fairford, but unfortunately the angel in the sketch is not playing a saxophone. The poem ends on rather a gloomy note. The branches break, the beaters are moving in. Lie still, my loves, like deer, let the lynx glide through the dappled underwoods. Lie still, he cannot hear, he may not see. Should the ravening death descend, we will be calm, die like the mouse, terrified but tender. The claw will meet no satisfaction in our sweet flesh, and we shall have known peace. In a house beneath a beechwood, in an acre of wild land. His great friend Bonamy Dobre, who was the professor of English here, told him off that. He said, why are you so gloomy? But I don't know. I think he felt this constant threat, not only to himself, but now to his growing family. The war eventually came to an end, but in a way it did not relieve the persistent trauma. This is, come out very well, an etching by Henry Moore to a poem by Herbert Reed, poem 1945. The poem runs, they came running over the perilous sands, children with their golden eyes, crying, look, we have found samphire, holding out their bone-ridden hands. It might have been the spittle of wrens, or the silver nest of a squirrel, for I was invested with the darkness of an ancient quarrel whose omens lay scattered on the silted beach. The children came running toward me, but I saw only the waves behind them, cold, salt and disastrous, lift their black banners and break endlessly without resurrection. We'll just note here that the way in which Reed's closest artist friends always focused on his poetry, either to illustrate or somehow relate to. Again, this note of gloom in the poem is almost as if once again, as we've seen with the poems between the wars, the thought of war brought out the shadows. In 1949 he returned to his native Yorkshire to live barely 5 miles from where he'd been born. It was pretty feudal in those days, I suspect still is to some extent. But the local landowners commented, some odd arty chap has moved in apparently. So they say, good war record though, so it can't be all bad. He was to join in the Hovingham British Legion Armistice Day celebrations if he was at home, and it led to a re-meeting with Squiffy, whom I remember well. Squiffy was PC Frank Asquith, military medal, policeman at Sinnington next to Kirby Moorside, who had been my father's runner during the 1918 retreat. He too had survived. And each year, on March the 21st, the anniversary of the German attack and the beginning of the retreat, they would try and meet or at least exchange greetings. In the post-1945 period, Reed rose to become an international figure in art, the so-called Pope of modern art. He served on international bodies like UNESCO and the Venice Biennale, the latter as regular nominee of the government-sponsored British Council. Through this agency in 1948, Henry Moore won the Venice Biennale Sculpture Prize, the catalogue introduced by Reed. Similarly, in 1952, with the presentation at Venice of the younger generation of British sculptors, the so-called Geometry of Fear sculptors were again introduced by Reed. Patrick Heron recounted the formation of AICA, the International Association of Critics of Art in Paris, after the war. Nominations were received of all sorts from around the world for the council, but way ahead at the top of the list throughout was Herbert Reed. This was also the period when Reed was developing a worldwide agenda for education through art, following the publication of his book of that title in 1943. He was elected the first president of the International Association. The point of both these fields of activity for Herbert Reed was, of course, the saving grace of art, and I must emphasize this. Only art, particularly the practice of art in education, could lead to the development of an integrated personality, which science could never do, that science which dominated the killing fields of World War I, and in the post-war period was advancing the development of nuclear weaponry. The integrated personality created through art would not need to go to war. It is entirely convincing to see Reed's total involvement with art as an effort to counteract the shadow, to banish the traumas he had suffered. Reed's anti-war campaigning started up immediately the war was ending with his leadership of the Freedom Defence Committee. This was formed in defence of 4 anarchists arrested for circulating insidious propaganda aimed at the still standing armed forces, inciting revolution, not to say mutiny. It attracted a wide range of freedom. As Herbert Reed wrote, "We've just defeated fascism, only to discover it still holds power in our own country." The speeches were published in a leaflet with the superb title, "Freedom, Is It a Crime?" The arrested anarchists worked for the Freedom Press. This is all published in the book. He denounced the American involvement in the Korean War, seeing the conflict with China as inevitably leading to another world war, with the prospect of universal nuclear annihilation. In 1961, Hansard, the Record of Parliament, recorded a declaration signed by Augustus John, Herbert Reed, Bertrand Russell and Michael Scott, denouncing the nuclear powers of East and West for holding the people of the world to ransom. It is time for people to act. Act, of course, some of them did. Here we are in Trafalgar Square, 1961. Reed had joined the Committee of 100 and joined in the public protests. You see him here with, he's sitting just there, my sister beside him, and you can't quite see it, but between, I think it's John Osborne and my father is my mother's head looking the other way. About my mother's politics, let alone those of my other siblings, perhaps the less said the better. My mother only rarely went in support of my father, who had recently suffered from cystitis, so sitting on a coal pavement was not a good idea. Nevertheless, in her typical style, when she thought it was time to go, she went up to a senior policeman and asked him to hire them a taxi, which he did. But my father grew dissatisfied with the tactics of the Committee of 100 and resigned in December 1961. He didn't think the tactics of public demonstrations were doing any good. They were antagonizing the general public by becoming too aggressive. I quote, "We have become a public spectacle, a group isolated from the general body of public opinion and feeling, a rowdy show to be televised and reported in the press for the interest and amusement of a majority who are not with us." He called for civil disobedience along Gandhian lines, and above all, on a policy of education aimed at the total demoralization of the general public. Note once more the call for education. This is the World War I Poets' Memorial and Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. In a way, he died for the cause. Although desperately ill with cancer, he was invited to lecture at an international congress of non-aligned nations in Cuba. In spite of strong advice against this, because the travel conditions, thanks to American foreign policy, were exhausting, he couldn't resist. His talk was an attack on the dollar imperialism of art. On his return, his condition gradually worsened and he died in June 1968. One of his bitterest opponents in the art world was William Coldstream, who once commented that Herbert Reed was one of the bravest men I ever met. I would like to end with a final poem written during World War II that in a way reflects his life, while also recalling the war he had experienced at such cost. Called The Contrary Experience. You cry as the gull cries, dipping low where the tide has ebbed over the vapid reaches. Your impulse died in the second summer of the war. The years dipped their bows brokenly over the uncovered springs. Hands wasted for love and poetry finger the hostile gunmetal. Called to meaningless action, you hesitate, meditating faith through a consciousness more patently noble. But even as you wait like Arjuna in his chariot, the ancient wisdom whispers, live in action. I do not forget the oath taken one frosty dawn, when the shadows stretched from horizon to horizon, not to repeat the false act, not to inflict pain, to suffer, to hope, to build, to analyze the indulgent heart. Wounds dried like sealing wax upon that bond, but time has broken the proud mind. No resolve can defeat suffering, no desire establish joy. Beyond joy and suffering is the equable heart, not indifferent to glory if it lead to death, seeking death if it lead to the only life. Libya, Egypt, Hellas, the same tide ebbing, the same gull crying, desolate shores and rocky deserts, hunger, thirst, death, the storm threatening and the air still, but other wings vibrating in the ominous hush and the ethereal voice thrilling and clear. Buffeted against the storm's sullen breath, the lark rises, over the grey, dried grasses rises and sings. Thank you.